Not every horror story starts with something breaking in from the outside. Some of the most disturbing films begin much closer than that, with loss that never heals, fear that feeds on uncertainty, or thoughts that slowly turn against the person having them. Across English-language cinema and unsettling international horror, there's a shared thread running through these stories. This is the kind of horror that doesn't rush. It settles in, changes behavior, and spreads through emotion rather than spectacle. By the time it becomes visible, the damage is already done. In this video, we'll explore each type, the way it messes with the mind, and the films that bring it to life. From grief that haunts, to paranoia that suffocates, to family homes that turn against you. Let's begin with Type 1. Grief horror. Loss becomes the monster. The Blackcoat's Daughter. Released in 2015, The Blackcoat's Daughter marked Osgood Perkins' first feature film, and it immediately showed the kind of slow, uneasy storytelling he was interested in. The film is set almost entirely at a Catholic boarding school during winter break, when most of the students have gone home and the building feels abandoned. Heavy snow cuts the school off from the outside world, which matters because nothing in this movie moves quickly or arrives to help. The story mainly follows Kat, a quiet student who stays behind with another girl named Rose. Kat barely speaks, but the camera spends a lot of time watching her move through empty hallways, stare at the boiler room, and listen to sounds that may or may not be real. The film also follows a separate storyline involving a young woman traveling alone through the same snowy region. At first, the connection between these stories isn't clear, and the movie doesn't explain its timeline in a straightforward way. Perkins lets scenes repeat or overlap slightly, and important information is held back until late in the film. When the pieces finally line up, the events at the school are recontextualized without adding new scenes, just new understanding. Men. Alex Garland made Men in 2022, and it feels like a film that starts simple and then refuses to stay that way. The story follows Harper, a woman dealing with the recent death of her husband, who rents a house in a quiet English village to get some distance from everything that happened. On the surface, it looks like a recovery trip. That calm doesn't last long. One detail the film makes very clear, almost immediately, is that every man Harper meets has the same face. Rory Kinnear plays the landlord, the vicar, a police officer, and several other figures around the village. Garland doesn't disguise this or treat it like a twist. It's right there, and the repetition becomes part of the experience rather than a puzzle to solve. The setting does a lot of the work. Open fields, stone paths, tunnels that carry sound too far. Garland lets conversations drag just a little longer than expected, which makes even normal exchanges feel tense. There's very little traditional horror pacing here. Instead, the discomfort comes from watching Harper constantly explain herself, apologize, or feel observed. Bring Her Back. By the time Bring Her Back arrived in 2025, Danny and Michael Philippou were already known for pushing grief into uncomfortable places, and this film leans straight into that instinct. The story centers on two step-siblings, Andy and Piper, who lose their father and are placed into foster care almost immediately. Their new home belongs to Laura, played by Sally Hawkins, who at first seems warm, attentive, and strangely eager to keep the children close. What stands out early is how ordinary the setup feels. There's no rush to explain anything supernatural. Instead, the film spends time watching how the kids process loss differently. Andy tries to stay protective and rational, while Piper is quieter, more observant, and clearly unsettled by Laura's behavior. Small details start stacking up, odd rules in the house, locked rooms, and conversations that don't quite land the way they should. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Laura is grieving too, and that grief has driven her toward an occult ritual meant to reverse death. The ritual at the center of the film is slow, deliberate, and deeply unsettling, tying loss to obsession in a way that never feels abstract. Type 2. Paranoia, horror, fear spreads through suspicion. It Comes at Night. Set during the collapse of society, It Comes at Night follows a family living deep in the woods, surviving under strict rules meant to keep them alive. Doors are locked at sundown, masks are worn outside, and trust is treated like a resource that can run out. When another family appears asking for shelter, the film shifts from isolation to uneasy coexistence. Nothing explodes right away. Instead, every shared meal, every conversation feels like a risk calculation. One of the most talked about choices Trey Edward Schultz made in 2017 was refusing to clearly define the threat. The illness exists, but it stays mostly off-screen. Nightmares bleed into waking life, and the film often cuts away before answers arrive. Even the title is deliberately vague. It never takes a clear shape, which frustrated some viewers and fascinated others. A lesser-known detail is that Schultz has said the story was inspired by recurring dreams he had as a child, where familiar places became dangerous without explanation. That idea shaped how the movie was shot, especially the tight framing and dim lighting, which limit what the audience can see at any given moment. The result is a film that plays less like a survival thriller and more like a pressure test, watching how people behave when certainty disappears and every decision feels irreversible. Hurt from 2018 takes place almost entirely over one night at a Halloween attraction in California, where a married couple tries to salvage a strained relationship by walking through a haunted hayride. The setting feels harmless at first: costumed actors, fake scares, loud music, but the film quietly strips that safety net away as the evening goes on. Emily Van Ray's character begins to sense that something is off, not just with the attraction, but with the people running it. The scares stop feeling staged, and the boundaries between performance and reality start to blur. What's unsettling is how long the movie lets that uncertainty sit. Scenes drag just enough to make you question whether you're watching paranoia build or a genuine threat unfold. Director Sunny Malhi leaned into realism here. Many of the extras were filmed inside a real haunted attraction with minimal rehearsal, which gives the crowd scenes an uneasy authenticity. The camera often stays close to the characters' faces, cutting off context and forcing the audience to share their limited perspective. Rather than escalating into spectacle, Hurt narrows its focus, trapping the viewer inside one person's growing fear while the world around her keeps insisting everything is just part of the show. They look like people. Back in 2015, Perry Blackshear made They Look Like People almost entirely on his own, writing, directing, shooting, and editing the film while keeping the scale deliberately small. The story centers on Wyatt, a quiet man who believes the world around him is being overtaken by creatures that look human but are anything but. He reconnects with his old friend Christian, who offers him a place to stay, unaware of the fear Wyatt is carrying with him. What's striking is how little the film relies on traditional horror mechanics. Most of the tension comes from conversations, awkward silences, and the way Wyatt reacts to everyday situations. Phone calls from an unseen voice guide his actions, warning him of an approaching threat, while Christian remains grounded, patient, and concerned for his friend's mental state. The film never rushes to explain who is right. Blackshear shot the movie on a tight budget using real apartments and locations, which gives everything a lived-in feel. The camera stays close, often handheld, and avoids flashy movement, keeping the focus on performance. McLeod Andrews' portrayal of Wyatt is key, balancing fear, confusion, and sincerity without exaggeration. Interestingly, They Look Like People premiered at Slamdance, not a major horror festival, and won a special jury award, which helped it gain attention as a character-driven psychological thriller rather than a conventional genre piece. Type 3. Infection. Contagion horror. Something spreads. Viral. In 2016, Viral leaned into a very specific fear that was already part of everyday life: the idea that something dangerous can spread faster than anyone can react. Directed by Ariel Schulman and Henry Joost, the film centers on two sisters, Emma and Stacy, who are stuck inside their suburban home after a mysterious outbreak forces the town into quarantine. Soldiers lock down neighborhoods, communication collapses, and no one is given a clear explanation of what the infection actually is. The illness itself behaves strangely. It spreads through physical contact, but its effects are inconsistent, sometimes violent, sometimes subtle. That uncertainty becomes the real tension. Emma begins noticing changes in the people around her, including her own sister, and the film stays close to her perspective as she tries to decide who can still be trusted. There's no scientist character offering answers, and no cure waiting in the background, just fragmented information and escalating panic. A lesser-known fact about Viral is that it came out during Blumhouse's early run of smaller, riskier genre projects, many of which played with modern anxieties rather than traditional scares. The movie also avoids showing large-scale chaos, keeping the focus tight on isolation, fear, and the breakdown of family bonds under pressure. Bloodline. By the time Bloodline surfaced in 2018, it caught a lot of people off guard, mostly because of who was at the center of it. Directed by Henry Jacobson, the film stars Sean William Scott in a role far removed from comedy, playing Evan Cole, a high school guidance counselor who appears calm, polite, and deeply committed to helping troubled kids. That surface matters because nothing about Evan looks threatening at first. The story slowly reveals that Evan lives a double life. Outside of school, he hunts down people he believes are guilty of abusing children and kills them. What makes the film unsettling is how methodical and controlled he is, keeping meticulous notes and convincing himself that what he's doing is necessary. The violence isn't random, it's targeted, planned, and tied directly to Evan's own unresolved trauma, which the film only feeds in pieces rather than spelling out. Bloodline also avoids the usual flashiness you'd expect from a film about a serial killer. Jacobson keeps the camera close and understated, letting Evan's everyday routines carry the tension. Teaching students, eating dinner, sharing quiet moments at home, it all sits beside the violence without distinction, which is exactly what makes it unsettling. Interestingly, the script was written with Scott specifically in mind, aiming to subvert audience expectations by casting him against type. Possessor. Possessor arrived in 2020 and quickly made it clear this wasn't going to be a clean or comfortable experience. Written and directed by Brandon Cronenberg, the film takes place in a near future where assassinations are carried out through a piece of invasive technology that allows one person to fully take over another person's body. The job looks simple on paper. The reality is anything but. Andrea Riseborough plays Tasia Voss, an elite operative who enters other people's lives without their consent, using them as disposable tools to carry out hits. Once the mission is complete, the host body is meant to be discarded. The problem begins when Tasia starts losing her grip on where she ends and her hosts begin. Her latest assignment, carried out through Christopher Abbott's character, turns into a prolonged psychological tug-of-war rather than a clean takeover. The film spends less time explaining the technology and more time showing the emotional cost of using it. Tasia's home life feels distant and strained, while her work identity starts bleeding into her personal one. Memories overlap, impulses clash, and control becomes fragile. Violence isn't sudden or chaotic, it's slow, intimate, and unsettling. One detail worth noting is that many of the film's effects were done practically, especially during moments where identities physically blur. Brandon Cronenberg has mentioned wanting the horror to feel tactile and invasive, reinforcing the idea that possession here isn't a concept, it's damage you can see. Type 4, Family Trauma Horror, when home becomes the threat. His House. In 2020, His House arrived quietly on Netflix, but it didn't take long for people to realize this was doing something very different with haunted house horror. Written and directed by Remy Weeks, the film follows Bol and Rial, a refugee couple who escape war in South Sudan, only to find themselves placed in a crumbling house on the outskirts of an English town. They're told to keep their heads down, follow the rules, and be grateful. Almost immediately, the house starts pushing back. At first, the disturbances were small. Strange sounds inside the walls, doors that don't stay shut, shadows that feel too close. But the film is less interested in cheap scares and more focused on the weight the couple carries with them. The film keeps things straightforward and focused on the people living in the house. Most of the tension comes from watching them try to settle into a place that never truly feels safe. The strange events are tied to their past, and the movie slowly brings those pieces forward instead of dumping everything at once. When the haunting finally takes shape, it feels earned because it connects directly to the choices they made before the story even began. The performances from Wunmi Mosaku and Sope Dirisu ground everything. Even when the supernatural elements surface fully, the film never loses sight of the emotional cost underneath. The Lodge. The story here centers on two siblings and their new stepmother, Grace, who travel to a remote winter lodge after a family tragedy. The year is 2019, and the film comes from directors Veronica Franz and Severin Fiala. The the same duo behind Goodnight Mommy. That connection matters because the tone is just as cold and controlled. Nothing in this house feels warm, even before anything strange starts happening. Grace is already struggling before they arrive. She is a survivor of a religious cult, and the film makes that background clear through small details rather than long explanations. Old habits, guilt, and fear follow her into the lodge. When supplies go missing and time starts feeling wrong, the tension stays grounded in how the characters react, not in flashy scares. A lot of the fear comes from isolation. Snow traps them inside, phones stop working, and the house becomes its own closed system. The kids begin to suspect Grace, while Grace starts questioning her own sanity. The movie never rushes these moments, letting silence do most of the work. Behind the scenes, the filmmakers even said they were interested in how belief and trauma shape reality, and that idea runs through every scene and places. The Lodge, firmly among horror films, where family wounds are the real engine driving everything forward. Relic. Relic is a 2020 psychological horror film directed by Natalie Erica James, who co-wrote the screenplay with Christian White. The story centers on three women from the same family, Edna, her daughter Kay, and her granddaughter Sam, who reunite after Edna disappears from her isolated country home. When she returns days later, confused and withdrawn, it becomes clear that something is wrong, even if no one can explain it outright. Most of the film stays grounded in everyday moments. Edna forgets conversations, wanders the house at night, and reacts with fear to things only she seems to notice. The house itself starts to change in small ways, with rooms shifting and dark patches spreading through the walls, mirroring Edna's mental decline. There is no rush to explain these events, and the film lets long silences and awkward interactions carry the tension. A key fact about Relic is that it was inspired by director Natalie Erica James's personal experience caring for a relative with dementia. That influence shapes the film's approach, where fear grows out of confusion, guilt, and responsibility rather than sudden shocks. Type 5. Unspoken evil horror. Nothing is explained. The Empty Man. The Empty Man came out in 2020 and was directed by David Pryor, who had spent years working on behind-the-scenes documentaries for David Fincher before making this his feature debut. The film follows a former police officer named James Lasombra, played by James Badge Dale, who becomes involved in the search for a missing teenager. What starts like a small-town investigation slowly opens into something much larger and far stranger. The story pulls from urban legend ideas, where a whispered name and a simple ritual are said to summon a presence known only as the Empty Man. As James digs deeper, he uncovers a cult connected to a belief system inspired by Western interpretations of Tibetan mysticism. One factual detail often overlooked is that the film opens with a long prologue set in Bhutan, which establishes the tone and themes before the main story even begins. That opening was shot separately and feels almost like a short film on its own. Unlike many supernatural films, this one avoids explaining its rules clearly. Information comes through journals, recordings, and secondhand accounts, which mirrors how real myths spread. The film also adapts ideas from The Boom, studio's comic series, but reshapes them into a standalone story rather than a direct retelling. Enys Men. In 2022, Mark Jenkin released Enys Men, a British folk horror film set in 1973 on a remote island off the Cornish coast. The story centers on a lone wildlife volunteer, played by Mary Woodvine, whose job is simple on paper. She lives in a stone cottage and documents the condition of a rare flower growing near an old mine shaft. Every day follows the same routine, carefully logged in a notebook, with little interaction and almost no dialogue. That routine slowly starts to fracture. Objects appear where they were not before. Time feels inconsistent. Physical strain and exhaustion become harder to ignore. The film never provides a clear explanation for these changes, and it never introduces a traditional threat. Jenkins shot the film on 16mm during lockdown, handling cinematography, editing, and sound himself. The grainy visuals and rough sound design give the film a handmade quality that feels deliberately stripped back. In all, great film, it's definitely a must-try. The Outwaters. In 2022, The Outwaters was written, directed, edited, and produced by Robbie Banfitch, who who also appears on screen. The film is built entirely from recovered memory cards belonging to a small group of friends who head into the Mojave Desert in 2017 to shoot a music video. What starts as a low-key creative trip slowly turns into something far stranger once unexplained sounds, lights, and disturbances begin surrounding their camp. The footage is deliberately fragmented. Long stretches focus on darkness, audio distortion, and partial visuals, often showing only what a handheld light catches in the frame. This was a conscious choice by Banfitch, who wanted the experience to feel disorienting and incomplete, rather than traditionally scary or explanatory. The movie was made on a reported budget of about $15,000, which explains its stripped-down approach. There are no clear answers, no defined creature, and no clean narrative handholding. The Outwaters also gained attention at festivals for how extreme its commitment was to found footage realism. So, it sits firmly in the category of horror that refuses to explain itself, leaving viewers with raw footage and letting them piece together what they think they witnessed. And that brings us to the end of this breakdown. Out of all these films, The Blackcoat's Daughter is a solid place to start if you want something quiet and emotionally heavy that slowly tightens its grip. But if you're curious about horror that feels unstable and deliberately disorienting, The Outwaters pushes that idea to an extreme and refuses to explain itself. If you enjoyed the video, tap the like button, share your favorite psychological or supernatural horror in the comments, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. There are plenty more unsettling films out there that dig deep into fear, memory, and the mind, and we're just getting started.